It's punk rock bowling time. That's right, for the 24th year, one of the greatest festivals on earth, in my opinion, returns to downtown Las Vegas the weekend of May 25th, 26th, and 27th. I have had some of my greatest times playing this thing and just hanging out at this thing. You want to know how much this festival speaks to Turned Out a Punk's mindset? The headliners are Devo, Descendants, and Madness. Every day of this festival, the lineup is stacked with amazing bands of all types and stripes of punk and hardcore from all different eras, from ska to post-hardcore. We're talking like Bratmobile to Rock from the Crypt to Stiff Little Fingers to the Cosmic Psychos to Scowl to Chad. And then there's also all these late night after shows which are happening. And you wouldn't believe the lineup of these things, from the Zeros to Agnostic Front and everything in between. This festival is out of control for fans of punk. So I hope I will see you there, because this isn't like some sort of festival that you just go to and the bands are secluded in some sort of backstage area. Bands and fans and just punks alike are all just taking over downtown Las Vegas. So you turn around and all of a sudden you're gambling beside John Doe from X. I don't know if John Doe gambles, but if you turn around on the buffet line, you'll probably see me. And you better believe we're going to be talking about punk music. And because this festival loves this podcast as much as this podcast loves this festival, Punk Rock Bowling is bringing you a series of special episodes. So each and every week, I will have an episode going up featuring someone that's playing this festival. And hot damn, are there some good ones coming. Head over to punkrockbowling.com and hopefully I see you in downtown Las Vegas, May 25th, 26th, and 27th. Hello and welcome to another edition of these very special Turned Out a Punk Rock Bowling podcasts. And today, oh my gosh, we got a monster for you. Jake Burns from Stiff Little Fingers, one of my favorite bands ever, one of my favorite vocalists ever, is on the show. And I'm very excited for you to hear this one. If you're looking at the runtime, you're like, how good could it be? It's a good one. Trust me. Stick around. But first, if you want to get in touch with me, head over to the email address, turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother, who is the show producer and the guest booker extraordinaire, and he will get the message to me. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Damian. There's a TikTok page, a YouTube page, a Facebook page, and an Instagram page, all for Turned Out a Punk. Those can be found at Turned Out a Punk. I play in a band. We are called Fucked Up. We will be playing some shows. I don't think they've been announced yet, but we will be. And we have some new records. So head over to fuckedup.cc for more information on that. And thank you for doing that. And tell all your friends about this thing. That's how you support this podcast. Tell all your friends about this show. And let them know that we got some good guests on lately. Holy, we are on a streak. And that continues today. As I mentioned off the top, this is one of those special punk rock bowling episodes. And woo, I'm excited to see this band play at Punk Rock Bowling. You heard me talk about it at the beginning of the show in that ad, so I'm not going to repeat myself now, but I will definitely be up front for this band. If you're one of those people that don't like when I ramble in these intros, skip ahead like 2 minutes, because I'm going to ramble here for a second. Stiff Little Fingers are a band that, like, when you get into punk music, you get the whole world laid out before your feet, and you're trying to put all these pieces together, and you're getting all these bands, and you're hearing stuff. You're like, that's great, that's great, that's great. And at least that's what it was like for me. And so I heard Stiff Little Fingers, and I'm like, this is great, but it was just another band as I'm taking this stuff all in. And it's not until a few years later when I guess I'm like 20 at this point, and I went out to visit my girlfriend at the time's family in Vancouver, and they were incredibly nice to me and gave me gifts when I showed up because they knew I liked music. They gave me a couple books about record cover art, as well as the Stiff Little Fingers Peel session. It was actually her uncle that gave it to me, and there's just something about that session that just clicked. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is actually one of my favorite bands ever, Stiff Little Fingers. And sort of ever since that point, I love this band. There's so many good songs, and his voice is just so sick. I can't hear the song Alternative Ulster without getting a lump in my throat. I'm not Irish at all. It actually has all of it to do with the fact that it's just like a bunch of punk kids, so like young kids, just screaming out to be able to do what they're doing. And like literally, you can hear them screaming on that song. Anyway, I'm not going to ramble on anymore. There's a lot I could talk about. Oh my gosh, I could go on forever, but I'm not. So hopefully, if you didn't want to hear this, you skipped ahead, and now you can sit back. Actually, I hope I see you all at Punk Rock Bowling, and if I don't, hopefully you get to see Stiff Little Fingers when they're coming to your town. They've got a bunch of dates announced all throughout May, all the way to August, all over Europe, and some on the East Coast as well. So I'll see them at Punk Rock Bowling. Hopefully I'll see you there too. If not, maybe you catch them on the road. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy Jake Burns on Turned Out a Punk. Jake, thank you so much for coming on this show.
Absolutely my pleasure.
Well, as I was kind of trying to force myself not to tell you off air, I'm a huge fan, and this is a big deal for me. And
well, thank you.
Years ago, my band was playing a show at Primavera Sound, and I was looking, and you guys were playing later on in the festival, and I was talking to the promoter, and I was like, oh my God, Stiff Little Fingers is playing. That's awesome. And he's looked at me deadpan and goes, of course, they're one of the best bands in the whole world. And you guys are one of the best bands of all time. And so this is a huge thrill.
That's very, very kind of you. Very kind of you.
Well, I got to start this off the way they all start off, which is, Jake, how'd you get into punk? Do you remember the first time you ever came across the word?
Well, a couple of people really. The British DJ John Peel was the guy who was playing it a lot, and this would have been obviously 1976 thereabouts. So obviously we were growing up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and there was a lot of unrest going on there at the time. So bands didn't come and play. So you were reliant on the radio and on the music papers to keep you up to date. So Peel was playing a lot. The papers were all agog about these bands like the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, the Damned. And we had no chance of seeing these guys live, so we were all reliant on sort of secondhand info. As a consequence of which, I was a bit slow off the mark. I was a big fan of people like Dr. Feelgood and Graham Parker, and people who rather unfairly got tagged as pub rock. It sounds like they basically got their start playing in bars, but they all had fairly healthy careers afterwards. But they were still sort of somewhat demeaned by this tag of pub rock, like they never got out of playing the back room of your local bar or whatever. So I was because we couldn't see them live or whatever. I was a bit slow off the mark. But Henry Clooney, our guitar player at the time, he really bought into it right from day one. As a consequence of which, we were all still living at home with our parents at the time. We were in our teens, and so he kept coming round to my folks' house and dragging all these records by people I'd never heard of, and going, "You got to listen to this. You got to listen to this. You got to listen to this." And some of it was great, and some of it was terrible. But that's the same with any type of music, So I was still not really convinced until, excuse me, he kind of left me with the first Damned, the first Ramones, and the first Clash album. When I'm not coming back for a week until you listen to these a lot. So he came back after a week, and I went, okay, I kind of get it now. And to be honest, it was the Clash were the ones that really, made me see that there was more to it than, basically a 3-minute short, sharp shock, which is, again, to be honest, I was sick of the bands that I'd grown up listening to by that stage, the Black Sabbaths and Deep Purples and people like that. I thoroughly enjoyed those bands when I was 14, 15, but I'd grown tired of the 10-minute guitar solo and stuff. So, listening to these guys felt like a return to the original sort of roots of rock and roll almost. It was like a 3-minute, 3-chord. I hate to use the phrase wham bam, thank you, man, but that was kind of what it was. It was in there, done. And and that was great. I mean, it was interesting actually. I became friends in later life with Rory Gallagher. It was like my first guitar hero. And he was telling me that he actually saw the Sex Pistols in San Francisco while he was recording an album, and it inspired him rather to go back to the studio and just scrap the entire record. And he basically said, as far as he was concerned, that was the closest to seeing Eddie Cochran he was ever going to get. And I think it showed you that some of the people that were in what was always some disparagingly referred to as the old guard, some of them actually got it.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a continuum. If you follow, there's like threads that go back. Like you brought up, well, a lot of people you brought up right there, like Dr. Feelgood, for example.
Yeah.
Like to me, that's British proto-punk.
Yeah, absolutely, and it wasn't just the fact that they did play sort of 3 minute songs that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was also their stage presence. I mean, there was a sort of thinly veiled violence about the Feel Goods when you saw them live. And amazingly, they were one of the bands that came and played in Belfast. And then again, sort of in later life, I was lucky enough to have Lee Brillo, the singer and harmonica player from the Feel Goods, come and play on a record for us, played harmonica on a record for us. And this sort of hugely macho guy you saw on the stage, pumping his fists and stomping up and down the boards, actually turned out to be the sweetest, most erudite, intelligent guy you've ever met in your life.
Yeah.
I guess to a degree, anything that you pull off on a stage is an act.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's funny you bring up the toughness and the sort of menace of that band, because you really do see that in the sort of well, I've only got to experience them through the live videos,
Right.
but I was reading this sort of account from an NME journalist that was on that I guess short sort of run they did when they played Belfast, and he was
Yeah.
talking about how intimidated he was, and there's a photo of them in front of a building that's got chain link fences in front of the windows and
Yeah.
everything, and they look a little scared. They look like a
Yeah.
little shook and a little out of their element.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Belfast was. I mean, to us, it was completely normal. People have often said, "What was it like growing up in Belfast?" And it's a bit like, you often hear sort of interviews with people who've grown up in really wealthy families, or people who've grown up even part of royalty, whatever, and say, what was it? Or in fact, actually, I think it was one of the monkeys was famously asked, what was it like being a monkey? And he said, compared to what? Because that was what you knew, and it was the same growing up in Belfast, although the opposite end of the scale. It was. There was a lot of unrest about. It was a pretty scary place, except for us, it was everyday life. And yeah, I mean, famously, the Clash came over and didn't play. They came across, and I believe the story was that they were refused insurance at the very last minute, and I do mean the last minute. It was like 7 o'clock on the evening of the show. But they didn't waste their time there. They went round and stood outside army checkpoints and heavily barricaded police stations and had their photographs taken and looked every inch the guerrilla warriors, and then scuttled off back to Notting Hill. And that kind of, it didn't necessarily ruin their reputation in Belfast, but it did give us all a bit of a wry smile.
Yeah, well, I guess like what you know, and it is your
Right.
reality.
Yeah.
I get like I want to obviously get back to the dawn of punk, but going back before that, there's almost like there is like sort of a proto punk thing in Belfast too. When you look at them, like the song Gloria, obviously is a
Right.
direct punk
It's
type,
classic. Yeah.
and even like the Wheels, like how like wild that band looks, and their the vocal style of that band. So there is kind of like a precursor to what you guys wind up doing, it seems.
Yes, I suppose so. I mean, obviously, again, sort of we were that little bit too young to have caught them and Van when he was starting. Um, but yeah, when you go back and listen to those records, and the fact it was interesting as well that back at a time when everybody was being marketed as lovable, the lovable mop tops and all that stuff, and you had the Rolling Stones who were the antithesis of that. But in the main, bands were, they were marketed basically as safe for radio play. And them were always referred to as the angry young them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess it's like any industrial town. I mean, Belfast was a shipbuilding town. It was a town of linen mills and pretty heavy industry. They built aircraft there as well. So I guess it's a bit like, probably its closest equivalent would be somewhere like Detroit or something. You're not going to be um, it's not some sort of bucolic rural setting. It's very much the opposite of that. And I guess, and again, that was actually the interesting thing about, since I just mentioned the Beatles being the lovable mop tops and the Stones being seen as the antithesis of that. If anything, in real life, the opposite would have been true. I mean, the Stones came from basically leafy London suburbs, and the Beatles grew up in damn Liverpool, for Pete's sake. I mean,
Yeah, well, I think it's always like it's easier to play that role sometimes than actually live that
right,
role.
right, right.
Uh, but it's interesting you bring up Detroit there too, because you look at where punk starts in America, and it is Detroit and Cleveland, so
Right.
these
Yeah.
industrial wastelands at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. I mean, there was a great Jake Riviera quote about from back in the days when he was managing the Damned, and they also had a journalist on tour with them, and the guy was there for like 4 or 5 shows, and some of which were in places like Middlesbrough, which again is an industrial town in the northeast of England, and others were in Gloucester, which is a nice little market town, and the journalist pointed out the marked difference between the reaction in both towns. And Riviera's quote is fantastic. He said, "Yeah, we go down better in towns where they bolt things together rather than where they grow things." And I mean, I think that's that kind of sums up the music as well. And even even though if to leave aside the proto punk side of things, I mean, Detroit also had they had the whole Motown thing going on, which even though it wasn't as hard edged as something like Stax was in Memphis, I would imagine that Berry Gordy was a pretty hard nosed operator to keep that thing afloat.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, going back actually for a second to the proto punk thing, the Wheels, that band, it's wild how the vibe of that band, the way the guy looked, he was like Lemmy's roommate for a while too on a farm or something. Like,
See, you mentioned this band a couple of times. They're not a band I'm even aware of. So
I've
you've caught me blindsided there.
well, I only know it from being a nerd and researching it, but they covered Gloria kind of the same time. I think they had to move or they moved to Blackpool in about 64. And I think most of the stuff they were doing was kind of like while they were in
Right,
Blackpool.
right.
Uh, the,
That would make sense.
the lead singer had a shaved head, a goatee, and apparently had a clock or a watch tattooed to the top of his head.
Okay, that's pretty hardcore.
He looks like Anton LaVey.
I was going to say like Rob Halford before Rob,
Yeah. But there is this kind of, I guess, drain that happens with a lot of artists that, because like you said, there's nowhere to play. There's not a
Yeah,
lot of, I guess, musical opportunities in terms of labels at this point. So it feels
mhm.
like a lot of the bands left.
Yeah. I mean, that was always seen as the logical step. And also, you got to remember that the Troubles, as they were referred to, because international bands wouldn't come and play there. We were left very much with the local talent, and there was a lot of local talent, but um, because the original bands weren't coming to play in Northern Ireland, basically the local talent was forced into these things called show bands. And basically, what a show band was a live jukebox. I mean, these guys would learn basically the top 20 of the day and go out and play it. And because, like I said, the originals weren't coming to play there, so folks wanted to hear the songs they heard on the radio, and that stifled local original talent because you try to get a show, say, and the people would ask, the first thing a promoter would ask was, what do you play? And we said, well, we write our own material. That was as far as the interview went. The phone would go down, and there was no interest in booking you. So that had been the case for a very long time. There was there was a sort of a burgeoning blues boom in Ireland, same as there was pretty much in the UK around the mid '60s. Obviously, on the back of the Stones and the likes of John Mayall's Blues Breakers and people like that. And that was where them obviously came through, and also where Rory Gallagher came through. And Rory has band Taste at the time, and they based themselves in Belfast because at the time that music was more popular there than it was south of the border. again, I think probably because Belfast was just that little bit more hard nosed,
Mhm.
and yeah, so for the longest period of time, ever basically since that blues boom of the late '60s, when the Troubles started in '69, effectively. So all the time I was growing up, I was 11 in 1969. So just as the time I was starting to get really interested in all this stuff, it stopped. I remember in 1971. Led Zeppelin came and very famously played in Belfast. I say famously because it was the first time they ever played Stairway to Heaven. Um, and they came and played. And I remember begging my dad to be allowed to go. And, at this stage, the bombing campaigns were pretty much, getting really into full swing. And, there I am, what age would I have been then? 71. I was uh, 13, 13, and begging my dad to go to this show. And he not unreasonably went, "You're not going anywhere." So, they were one of the very few bands that did come across and play. And it really wasn't until punk rock came around that bands started writing their own material. I mean, when we started out, excuse me, when we started out, we basically, our mindset was so, basically fashioned by what we'd grown up with, that we basically just started. We covered like the entire first Damned album, the entire first Ramones album, and most of the Clash record, because you didn't actually, you thought, well, we could try and write our own songs, but who the hell's going to be interested? So it was, there were a number of not just physical hurdles, but mental hurdles you had to overcome as well.
It's it's interesting because obviously being one of the first capital P punk scenes to emerge, Belfast almost sets this sort of pace for punk showing up in places where the situation is oppositional to youth culture and just like
Yeah.
finding a way to exist. And like you said earlier, this is your reality. Like this is what you've grown up with. I find it fascinating that, like you said, the what's referred to as the Troubles sort of ends or doesn't end, but subsides at just the dawn of punk. So it almost feels like all of you were just ready to explode, and it does explode. There's so many fucking incredible bands in that wave.
Yeah, there were a lot of people, all of which just confirmed, what I'd always thought, which was that the talent was always there. It just wasn't being given the chance to shine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were a lot of bloody awful bands as well, but that's the case. That's the case with any scene. But the interesting thing was even the bands that weren't that great seemed to, and this has always struck me about the initial sort of first 2 years or so of punk rock in the UK, and actually to some degree over here in the US as well, but mainly the UK because it was so concentrated. Was even the bands that weren't that great seemed to have one great song in them. It's like that old cliche about everyone has a novel in them. It seemed at the time that everybody had one great song, and even if you never heard of them again, I could probably wander down into my basement now and pull out at least 20 fantastic singles by bands that I've never heard of since, but that are great, great records. And I think, that was, it was almost like you were being given permission to do it, which was just incredible. It was great.
Well, I think that's like you're saying, everyone's got one great novel in them potentially, and punk was that's why it's a 7-inch genre because there's
Yes,
everyone you got
absolutely.
one side of a 45. Everyone can nail that.
Right.
Uh, Going back to the Highway Stars, did you guys play live at all?
A couple of times. Yeah. I mean, basically it was a school band that, it was where we learned to play effectively. We weren't we were when I was referring to bloody awful bands, we would have definitely fallen into that category. We were terrible. But we were learning, and I mean the interesting thing about that as well was the sky was very much the limit. We really couldn't play that well at all, and yet I'm standing up the front trying to play like Rory Gallagher. I could barely tune the damn thing. But the fact that we actually felt we could try that and maybe get away with it was, I guess, testament to the confidence of youth, I suppose. I mean, or the
Yeah.
folly, whatever way you want to think of it. But it was, the very few times we did play, it was certainly it was a learning experience. I mean, you threw yourself in at the deep end, and I mean, we got a couple of shows in bars in the centre of town. And again, had it been anywhere else where people weren't starved of entertainment, we probably would have been lynched and thrown into the streets for being rubbish. But we got away with it. And from that point of view, punk rock couldn't have happened quickly enough for us, because by the time it did come around, and we all rapidly adopted it as something that we fell in love with. We were in the right spot at the right time, because by that stage we could play well enough to pull that off, but not so well that we sounded like some sort of Johnny Come Lately charlatans, which we were accused of anyway. But that was.
There's something about punk though, because it can happen anywhere. Like, it doesn't need to be in a proper music hall. It doesn't need to have the best gear.
Right, which was just as well, really.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so awesome, and that's what I think is so great about what happened in Belfast, even if people refer to it as a come lately thing, because to me that's like the scene where people built it under adverse conditions,
Right.
and it was proof of concept, and that's what today punk still allows for kids to just kind of set up a show wherever they need to.
Yeah, and I think that's also, where what I was saying about the strength of the material comes in, because again, much like every form of youth culture that's ever been, the generation that went before basically, derided it as that's not music and I can't hear the words and all that stuff. And yet, here we are talking, 46, 47 years after we formed the band, and we're still playing a lot of those songs, that I wrote in, my bedroom in my folks' house when I was 18 years old. So it's, I think, there was something there, and there was a lot of talent that was just itching to be heard, even if it was just like we said earlier, one side of a 7-inch single. They had something to say effectively.
How important was Caroline music to what was happening for you guys? I guess prior
Well,
to what happens.
yeah. Well, Caroline was. I mean, it was a record store, but I mean, unlike there were a couple of record stores in Belfast that were sort of established. There was a very staid one called the Gramophone Shop, which basically, as you can imagine from its name, although it sold rock records and stuff, it basically its classical section was bigger than anybody else's.
Yeah.
There were a couple of other stores that they weren't chain stores, but they had a few branches, if you like. And Caroline was almost the first independent that pitched up. And the joy about Caroline was the people who staffed it were actually music fans. You could go in there, and I mean, I actively remember before punk had happened, going in and talking to the guys in there and saying, "Look, I'm sick to death of all this heavy metal stuff. What have you got that's different but is exciting?" And you could actually have that conversation. Whereas a lot of the other stores, you just basically went in, and if you didn't know, what record you wanted to buy, they would, not effectively throw you out the shop, but they didn't have time for you. They were sales assistants, and that was it. The guys in Caroline were music enthusiasts, and that made a huge difference. And that was before I'd even heard of Terry Hooley, and he'd formed Good Vibrations and stuff. So, I think Caroline very unfairly got overlooked in the whole story of what was happening in Belfast at the time, because they were pretty much vitally important.
Yeah, like from what I've understood, like one of the guys from Caroline was also key in getting some of the venues to kind of open up to playing, or like you're saying, non-cover bands finally were allowed to
Yeah.
play.
Yeah, I mean that's probably Kyle. Yeah, I mean they like I said they were enthusiastic, and they were. I mean they were also, as it turned out, when bands did start to play there, really really good people to know, because they were also one of the main ticket agencies for bands. So when the likes of the Feelgoods came over, for example, I mean they came across, and the week they came over, their album Stupidity went to #1. So I mean the show was an instant sellout. But because I'd known these guys for years, and I had a day job at the time, I remember frantically phoning the record store from my day job, and basically going, "You will keep me," and they went, "It's okay, we've got your ticket set aside. Don't worry." I went, "Oh, thank God for that." So, there were other advantages rather than just sort of, hey, you've got to hear this new record by Johnny and the Snot Gobblers or whoever it happened to be. It's like,
So Gordon Blair from Highway Stars goes and joins Rudi after
Mhm.
he leaves the band. Uh, were they like, and that's like 75, right? Or 76, maybe like
No,
pre-punk.
that would have been later. That would have been, yeah, that would have been 70s, late 76, early 77. Yeah.
Okay. So just before, I guess, the Rudi single's going to come out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think Rudi were the first band to release a single. It was either them or the Outcasts of the local bands. They were the first to release a single. But Rudi had been around for a while. Again, I'd never heard of them. The same with the Outcasts. These bands just suddenly seemed to pop up fully formed when punk rock happened. And I mean, that was interesting as well, because at the time we kind of thought we were the only four people that were listening to this music. And until the night of that cancelled Clash show, when we turned up and there were like 200 or 300 people milling around outside the venue, we're like, God, all these people know who the Clash are. That's impressive.
Had there been punk shows prior to that, waving the flag type punk shows?
Uh, Basically, just the local bands.
Yeah.
That was when we were, aware of. I think the first show we played at least Brian from Rudi was in the audience. There may have been a couple others, because the show we played was pretty much, it was in their neighborhood, so we're pretty much bang on their doorstep, and that was when the heckling of each other's bands pretty much started that night, the very first show. So we walked on and played a few songs, and then Brian yelled out to play something by the New York Dolls of all things. And so, interestingly, I actually knew the guitar riff to the start of Jet Boy and played it. And he luckily went quiet at that point, which was just as well, because that was the only bit of the song I knew.
I guess there's like, it's kind of become stuff of legend that there was sort of this, I don't know, rivalry, or at least sort
Yeah.
of distance between Good Vibrations and yourselves. Like, is there a separate kind of scene going on, like more around Caroline music? Because I've heard punks hung around Caroline Records too, and
They
that was
did.
like a hot spot. Was there like two scenes kind of happening
No,
simultaneously?
not really. No, I mean, I think the main reason that the whole, sort of any form of, possibility of a rivalry between ourselves and Good Vibrations came around basically because we didn't sign to the label. We just stayed independent, and that wasn't even a conscious decision, really. It was just our manager at the time, Gordon, basically said, let's go ahead and press a record. And, Good Vibes had only put out the Rudi single, I think, at that point. So it wasn't like they were, a Motown, since we mentioned Detroit earlier. It wasn't like they were an established label or anything. As far as we knew, they were putting out the Rudi record, and that was it. So, it wasn't like, Terry hadn't built his empire, as it were. So, yeah, I mean, I tended to butt heads with Terry quite a bit, mainly because, well, I was 18, 19 and opinionated, and he was that little bit older, and I mean, Terry's never short of voicing an opinion either, even to this day. I mean, so uh, it was just a clash of personalities more than anything else. But I always had more than a grudge and respect for Terry, not just because of what he ended up doing, but what he'd done in the past. I mean, he'd been, the more you find out about the guy, the more you find out he was quite the mover and shaker back in the day. So he was certainly always, an activist of some sort. And always, to his eternal credit, always, completely an advocate of peace and non-sectarianism through what were really difficult days.
It's also, it seems like a time old tale in punk that you have people that ultimately are on the same side, but just because we're all stuck together and fight, I guess, fighting for our own turf in this thing, or just
Yeah.
not even fighting for our turf, right? Just like holding on to it in our own way, we end up butting heads. And then years later, you realize, because I read in an interview where he said that you guys were the one that got away. Like he wishes that was the record. Those were the records he had put out too.
Possibly, and I mean, it's also true to say that the record, a lot of the records, not all of them again, but a lot of the records on those early Good Vibrations records, the sound on some of them was fantastic. I mean, again, although Gordon Blair had left us and gone to join Rudi at this point, we had recorded the backing track to Suspect device. We were supposed to do the whole thing in an afternoon, and I lost my voice, so I had to go back on the Tuesday. We recorded it on the Saturday. I had to go back on the Tuesday and do the vocal. And in the interim, I remember Gordon popping up at my folks' house again with a copy of Big Time, their first single. And I'd already heard our backing track, and I knew what it sounded like. And then he played me Big Time, and I sat there trying not to seethe with jealousy because it sounded fantastic, and so much better than ours. I mean, it was so much more alive. There was a lot more power to it. So, I don't know what magic formula Terry had with a couple of those records. I mean, that and obviously the Undertones first record that came about later. I mean, those were both fantastic sounding records. And, to this day, I still think that the original recording of Suspect, it's why we re-recorded it for the first album, is because I always felt that the sound of the initial single was so thin. And yeah, so there wasn't there was an amount of jealousy in terms of the sound and stuff, but it was very much a friendly and I think a healthy jealousy. It wasn't, sort of I hate them and I hope they all, their truck falls off a bridge into the river or something. It was more, damn, how did they do that and how can we do it? It was more that sort of thing. And the fact that we would turn up at each other's shows and heckle one another, and then just as likely go to a bar and have a beer afterwards together. So it wasn't, it was never a particularly nasty rivalry.
Well, and Rudi opened for you at some point, right? I've seen a flyer at least.
Yeah, they have done. They have done a couple of times. Excuse me, or they did do, back in the day a couple of times. But again, that was because, again, so much of, as you'll know yourself, I mean, so much of the music business is luck. Because we were lucky and got the break, and
Absolutely.
a lot of those didn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's right. I meant just sort of that you guys had played together, and so there must be some.
Yes,
sort
we
of,
had. Yeah, we did, and we used to even back in the day, and that was actually where a lot of the rivalry would come from, because the other thing was there was such an outpouring of creativity as well. I mean, not just Rudi, but the Outcasts as well, as I mentioned, and they would have, you'd play with them, and then 2 weeks later you'd play with them again, or you'd go see them, and suddenly they had 4 new songs in their set, 2 of which were like, oh, where did that come from? So that was it's interesting because at the time I don't think any of us took the time to stop and breathe and think just how exciting it was at the time. At the time, it was just oh yeah, they've got a bunch of new songs. I guess we better get our finger out and start writing again. So.
Well, it's interesting because you brought up like the fact that every band has like one good song in them, but there's just all you guys had so many good songs. And say what you will about that first single that you guys did, I think it sounds fucking awesome. And it is different sounding than the Rudi record, but it does have an immediacy to it that just is, well, I don't know, godly.
Well, I think that a lot of those records, again, the Irish ones, as opposed to some of, excuse me, some of the English ones or whatever, where I think that a lot of the guys who were recording in England were aware that there was a chance that they could get this record onto an A&R guy's desk, and he might come see them, and they might get the record contract that would lead to who knows what. From our point of view, trying to get somebody to actually either get on a plane or get on a boat and come across the Irish Sea was daunting enough. But to then come to what was effectively a war zone was really daunting. So I think there was a desperation to those records that was probably missing, and I think that might be what you're hearing when you refer to as an immediacy, was that there was an element of, this is going to be our one chance at this,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And well, like you said, the Outcasts and obviously the other bands you mentioned, but then you like "Don't Ring Me Up" by Protex, like the Victim single, like there's just like an unbelievable deluge. Like it's like I'd be hard pressed to like look at any other scene in that part of the world around that time and find that many classic singles coming out. Like it's incredible. Like you said, there's just so much talent that was just, I guess, being held back and just
right,
ready to go.
Excuse me. Yeah.
The other band I wanted to I should have thrown in there was the Star Jets, who you guys
Yeah,
played with quite a bit, right?
yeah. Well, the Starjets were a year or so ahead of everybody, but they were seen very much as a pop band, and they could play. God, they could play. I mean, they were better than anybody, but they'd already moved to London by that point, and they had got a record deal. They had signed to Epic, so they were way more professional. And I mean, to the point that I remember when we were first starting to play outside of Belfast, and we were just going to play like little coastal towns like Portrush and stuff up in the north coast. And we ended up using the same driver and road guy that the Starjets had used before they moved to the UK. And I remember Johnny, the driver, asking me about them a lot and said, "Have you ever heard of them?" I said, "No, I'd never heard them." And basically, he was bemoaning the fact that we were so disorganized. Like those guys are like a military operation, and you guys just sort of shamble in, and you leave. We'd get to the gig and go, "Has anybody got the guitar cables?" No, we left. Oh, damn it. Oh, okay. Now what do we do? We were not we were not the most together bunch of people. Whereas they were always being held up as this paragon of virtue. But yeah, when we came to Britain, came to London rather. We got to know the Starjets guys mainly through Jim Riley when Jim joined the band, because Jim had grown up in the same neighborhood as those guys and he knew them all. And it was Jim who put them forward as an opening act on one of our early, headline tours. And we loved them, not just as a band, but as people. I mean, they were great, great guys. And yeah, we're still close. I mean, they played the Belfast, our annual Belfast show with us last year. In fact, I ended up marrying the bass player's sister. So there were a lot of connections. Back in the day.
It also, like you said, they moved to London kind of a year before everything happened, so they were
Yeah.
just like wrong, like right band but wrong time type thing.
I think actually, and it's one of those things. I mean, I can see exactly why they went. They went there because there's only so much you could do in Northern Ireland before you reached your limit, if you like. So you had to go across the water. It was always referred to as going across the water, and try your luck in the bigger pond. And ironically, I think if they'd hung around for one more year, they probably could have been, kings of that scene, really, because they were that good. I mean, they were head and shoulders above in terms of playing above everybody else, and they wrote some great songs. So it was just, like you said, yeah, they were the right band in the right place. They just moved at the wrong time. That was all. Yeah.
It's fascinating how all you guys are obviously not doing the same thing, but like independently are all kind of going in the same directions, but everyone's doing it in such isolation. It seems like from
Yeah.
the sounds of it, no one really knew about anyone, but I guess that's because you weren't really allowed to have a scene because of what was happening around you.
Right. I mean, that was the thing. You stayed in your own neighborhood. You very rarely crossed the line. And the other thing, I mean, unlike Derry, where the undertones are from, the city is very much divided into two halves, or it was back in the day, by the river that ran down the middle of it. So basically, if you were on one side of the river, that was basically they were all Catholic neighborhoods, and the other side of the river were all Protestant neighborhoods. Belfast was much more like a patchwork quilt. So you could go from one neighborhood to the next and find yourself in, if for want of a better term, enemy territory. That sounds awfully dramatic, but
Mm.
and you could do that. I mean, where I used to work, to walk home, I would cross those lines 3 or 4 times on the walk home from work. That would just never happen in other towns. So as a consequence of which, yeah, you tended to stay in your own neighborhood. It was really only the center of the city that was any sort of demilitarized zone, if you like. I really shouldn't laugh about it because it wasn't a laughing matter at the time, but
Well, once again, it's what you grew up with. Like it's your
yeah, I
reality.
mean, it definitely breeds a certain gallows humor, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, like, and once again, not to dwell on it, but they're gangs snatching people off the street, killing people. Like there's just like
Yeah,
it
yeah,
seems like
that
a
did happen.
very tough place to be in.
again, we had nothing to compare it to,
Yeah, yeah. Well, moving back to the more universally favorable topic of music, it you mentioned blowing out your voice while recording the first single, and
Yeah.
your vocal is a huge influence on not just myself, obviously a lot of people in punk music, but myself. Uh, what was the influence on going that hard on the vocal? Because you do have such a vicious attack.
Again, it was people that I liked. We mentioned Lee Brillo. Lee Brillo was a huge influence on that from Doctor Feelgood, and Strummer as well. That probably led to it being indecipherable. I probably went a bit too far down the Joe road there. But so yeah, those guys, and it seemed like most of the vocalists I like had that style of voice, and also it was to cover up to a large degree the fact that I couldn't sing. Um, you know, I'd hear these other guys, and I mean nobody was well, with the possible exception of Fergal from the Undertones, nobody was really a gifted vocalist in those bands. So there were a lot of indistinct voices that were fighting to stay in tune, but there was nothing. There wasn't a voice you'd hear and go that. Apart from, like I said, you'd hear Fergal Sharkey and go that Fergal Sharkey. So there weren't any really distinctive voices. So I guess mine became that just because of the sheer volume and gravel in it. Really, I suppose And it's interesting over years. Excuse me. Over the years, I've learned how to sing, so the gravel has pretty much disappeared. I mean, I still throw it in occasionally, but um, we find that once we started doing longer tours, it was a bit rough on the a bit rough on the old vocal cords to do it every night.
Yes, I can very much very much attest to that as someone who has not learned to sing, and
Right.
still
Yeah.
still still stuck in the gravel. But that is the it's like that's like you're saying, a new style of vocal at that point that becomes part of hardcore, screamo. The idea that you're not, because so much of singing properly is about control and
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
and this is about just emoting and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
giving the
That's true.
audience, yeah. And it's I don't know, the birth of reality music and punk.
I mean, I don't want to make any great claims for it because it came about by accident, and like I said, it was to cover sort of the insufficiency of my voice. So, I'm not going to make any great claims for it. And to be honest, it never really occurred to me until um, I'm trying to think exactly when I did it. But I've done a couple of tours just with an acoustic guitar opening for the Dropkick Murphys and other bands that they've had with them. And I was talking to one of the guys, I think in Rancid, and he basically said to me, talking about, style of vocal style, he basically stopped halfway through and said, "Hell, you taught us all how to sing." And I thought, I never really thought of it like that. You know,
Well, that's the impact of what you, and specifically you guys and yourself, but also like a lot of the bands, but like the immediacy of that and how quickly that went around the world. Like that band Anarchy in Japan is covering you guys like 2 years later.
Yeah, it was interesting. I remember the first. Excuse me, God, there's a real frog in my throat this morning for some reason.
It's that gravelly voice.
It's all that talk of the voice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember the first time I heard a cover of one of our songs. It was a cover of "Wasted Life" by a band from Finland, and it was John Peel played it, and it was identical and right down to the screaming vocal, but it was in Finnish. And when the record came to an end, Peel said, "I have absolutely no idea what they're saying about it," but and I remember listening to again. I was still living at home with my folks, and to suddenly hear somebody in Finland cover something that I'd written in the bedroom I was sitting in was bizarre beyond belief. It was really bizarre. And then, yeah, like you said, then the cover version started coming, not necessarily thick and fast, but from really unexpected quarters. Probably more is probably a better way to put it.
Well, and those like that I think also shows that this is like an international music. Like that's when it's becoming clear that this is something that, and obviously the Beatles were worldwide phenomena, but that there is sort of this like cultural interplay that's happening globally, which you don't really see in many forms of popular Western music, like jazz. I guess maybe you see. I don't know. Actually, I don't know if enough about jazz to even say that about jazz, but like the fact that you have a global punk scene that's just connected by the fact that we all love punk, and that's when it begins
Well,
to form.
I think also to be fair to me, I think it's it's an easy music to play, and it's a gateway music. I mean, it's something you can pick up. I mean, again, very famously, the Sniffing Glue fanzine posted three or posted shows you my even my vocabulary changed over the years. Printed a page that had three chord diagrams on it. That just said, "Here's a chord, here's another one, there's a third, now go form a band." And I mean that is any sort of diktat as to how you start up a punk rock band is as good as it gets, really. And I think that's one of the reasons that you find it popping up all over the place, because kids will always want to, I hope they'll always want to anyway, sort of express themselves through music. And you can suddenly make a half decent noise pretty quickly and pretty satisfyingly, So, and if that then enables you to express the frustrations you've got inside you, then I'd much rather you did it with a guitar than a rifle. So,
Well, I think it's the filmmaker Cocteau said that film was never going to be a true art form till cameras were as cheap as pencils and pieces of paper. I feel like making a band kind of became a true art form when punk showed up, because like you're saying, all you needed were these three chords, and you didn't even need those three chords. You could go up on stage and just bang a chair and yell into a microphone, and
yeah,
like John
the
Cooper
Tom
Clarke.
Waits approach. The Tom
Yeah.
Waits approach. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've seen people do that, or something very similar. Yeah, and yeah, great. Anything that gets it out, sure.
And it was all valid and important.
If it's
How
important to you, and you believe in it, then it's valid, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Well, how important was John Peel, do you think, to Belfast music kind of getting exposed to the world like that?
Not just Belfast music. Peel is vital, and you can trace Peel's influence and all the way back to the mid '60s. When he first, I mean, he originally started his broadcasting career actually over here. He started in Dallas, but um, when he came back to the UK, and particularly when he got the show on Radio One, which was his first national show in the UK. I mean, even back then he was bringing in bands to play sessions. This came from a loophole in the contract that the Musicians Union had with the BBC, where they had a thing called needle time, where they were only allowed to play a certain number of records. Um, and then they had to have live sessions. So there was a BBC radio orchestra, and it was designed because back when the contracts were all struck, the majority of top selling records were vocal artists backed by an orchestra, and it was designed so that the musicians in the orchestra would get the extra work. So to get around this needle time restriction, the BBC had its own orchestra and all that sort of stuff, and they would play live inserts into every radio program. Well, Peel and DJs like him realized there's no reason why it has to be the BBC orchestra. We can get Pink Floyd in, and they did. And so then the Peel sessions were born, basically, to give these bands an outlet. And so Peel he'd been vital, like I said, from Pink Floyd through, Led Zeppelin, T-Rex, David Bowie, all these people. And he always seemed to be one step ahead. I don't know. I mean, I worked at Radio One for a year, and I saw Peel's office, and it was just mayhem. I mean, it was just floor to ceiling with demo tapes from bands and records. I mean, it kind of overflowed out into the corridor. Um, so, I was about to say I don't know who does his research, but I do. It was Peel did his research, and Peel did it all himself, and he always seemed to be just one step ahead of. He seemed to know what was coming around the bend before anybody else did. As a consequence of which, you know, you heard a lot of exciting stuff on there. You also heard a lot of almost unlistenable stuff, because he was always willing to take a risk, and it also, as he would openly admitted himself, he often played records at the wrong speed and stuff because he was a bit slapdash at times. Um, There's an hilarious story of, I think it's Brian Eno, hearing one of his albums being played, and it's being played at the wrong speed. And so he phones the switchboard as this is going out live. And Peel was on late at night. He started at 10 o'clock at night. So he gets this tired, uninterested switchboard operator and says, I need to talk to John Peel. And he said, I'm sorry, Mr. Peel's on the air. He said, I know that. My name's Brian Eno, and he's playing my record at the moment, but he's playing at the wrong speed. Whereupon the operator said, oh, they all say that, and hung up on him.
He yeah, like what there's few people that had that kind of impact, not just where the BBC is being broadcast to, I think globally because of those Peel sessions like John Peel had
Yeah.
on Underground Music.
Yeah.
And like you're saying, it goes back to the 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'd long argued that Peel was probably the single most important figure in British music from the 60s through, leaving aside the bands, obviously. But, it just it's a terrible phrase. And I know that Peel would have hated it, but to refer to him as an arbiter of taste is actually not too far off the mark.
Yeah. I remember, do you know Sean Forbes from Rough Trade? He was in uh, uh, Hard Skin and
No, this would have been long after he would have been
okay.
long after our time
Yeah.
at Rough Trade.
He when John Peel passed away, he had this list of the records that John Peel left to the BBC in this record box, and it just
Yeah.
became my want list. I was like, I gotta find this somewhere. Like these records are all gold because, like you're saying, like even though he probably would have hated hearing it, but he had an incredible ear, especially for punk. Like the stuff that he played on that show and the importance of the stuff he played on that show. It's just like, oh, I'm forever grateful to him. I wish I got to meet him to tell him.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he was actually a very shy guy. I mean, like a lot of people, it's like um, for somebody that was that important. I think because the music was important to him, sort of the cult of personality didn't interest him at all, from what I can tell.
Mm-hmm.
But he also, I mean, he was very much an enthusiast, and he wasn't shy in you know. To use an Irish expression, he wasn't backward in coming forward at times. And the very first time I met him was actually in Rough Trade. It was in the shop, and he was wearing a Ruts button, and the Ruts at the time had just put their first single out. And I think we had only released two singles, and we were about to record the album, or maybe we just recorded it, but we hadn't released it yet, the first album. And so we'd two singles out, and they had one. And he pointed at the button and said to me, he said, "Have you heard of these people?" And I said, "Yeah, I've heard the single." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I think they're the next Stiff Little Fingers." And I said, "We haven't even been the next Stiff Little Fingers yet, for Pete's sake." It's like, so any chance we can do it first before somebody else jumps on our back.
Yeah. How did the relationship with Rough Trade kind of come about? Like, cause it's right in the beginning, right? Like after the first press of the
Pretty much,
single.
yeah. I mean, basically, Gordon, our manager, was traveling to and from London because he was working for a national newspaper at the time. And he was basically just taking boxes of suspect device over in the trunk of his car and touting them around record stores and, asking if anybody wanted to buy them. And Rough Trade were among the people who took quite a few of them. So much so that when we came over to do the Tom Robinson tour in 1978, and we'd just been let down by Island Records with regards to a contract. We were looking for a way of releasing a single to go along with the tour, and Gordon happened to be in there buying records, I think. And one of the guys asked, "Well, what the band were up to," and he said, "Well, they're coming over to do this tour, but unfortunately, we're not going to have a record out." And they said, "Well, we put the occasional record out." I think they'd released 5 singles at that point. So they were very much, they were the London equivalent of Terry Hooley at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, we'd love to put a single out for you. And they put Alternative Ulster out for us to coincide with the TRB tour. And that's really how it started. And, we were convinced that at the end of the TRB tour, we'd get, having been let down by Ireland, we were convinced that, we'll put us in front of an audience and we'll do the job. We were convinced we'd get a record deal by the end of that tour. And that didn't happen. And so we were kind of disappointed. And it was Jeff Travis said to us, "Look, I remember it as clear as day. We were in the bar at the Hammersmith Odeon after the Tom tour. Well, it was just about to finish. And he basically said, look, we've never made an album, you've never made an album. Why don't we make an album together? And that was how it came about. It was really that, and it was all done on a gentleman's agreement, a handshake, and we'll split the profit 50-50. You try and get that deal out of Warner Brothers, see how far you get.
Yeah, exactly. And like you're saying, like who knows what happens when you get on a major label like Island
Right.
versus something like that.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing. When we did eventually sign to Chrysalis, their managing director asked Gordon how many copies of the first album we'd sold, and he told him, I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but he basically said, "Oh, we'd have sold double that." And that's obviously sort of major label bravado, but it's also, looking back on it, I'm thinking you probably wouldn't, because we'd have made a different record. We wouldn't have made. It wouldn't have been as raw. It wouldn't have been as unstructured. It would have, they'd have put us in a studio with a proper producer, and that have ironed out all the rough spots. And as much as I find, I don't listen to our records at home. I don't know anybody in a band who does listen to their own records, to be fair.
It's terrifying to think about people that do that. Like you got to be like a special kind of psycho to want to listen to yourself on the day off.
Yeah, I mean, the only time I listen to them is if we decide to put a song in the set we haven't played in ages. How the hell does that go again? And that's the only time I'll listen to it. But yeah, I mean, I think the rough spots are what gives that record its charm. And what made it the record that it is. So anyway,
Jake, this has been awesome. And anytime you want to come back and talk more of this stuff, I'd love to talk to you forever.
Well, thank you. It was very detailed. I was like, I feel like I'm 19 again.
It's punk rock bowling time. That's right. For the 24th year, one of the greatest festivals on earth, in my opinion, returns to downtown Las Vegas the weekend of May 25th, 26th, and 27th. I have had some of my greatest times playing this thing and just hanging out at this thing. You want to know how much this festival speaks to Turn Out a Punk's mindset? The headliners are Devo, Descendants, and Madness. Every day of this festival, the lineup is stacked with amazing bands of all types and stripes of punk and hardcore from all different eras, from ska to post-hardcore. We're talking like Bratmobile to Rock from the Crypt to Stiff Little Fingers to the Cosmic Psychos to Scowl to Chat. And then there's also all these late night after shows which are happening. And you wouldn't believe the lineup of these things, from the Zeros to Agnostic Front and everything in between. This festival is out of control for fans of punk. So I hope I will see you there, because this isn't like some sort of festival that you just go to and the bands are secluded in some sort of backstage area. Bands and fans and just punks alike are all just taking over downtown Las Vegas. So you turn around and all of a sudden you're gambling beside John Doe from X. I don't know if John Doe gambles, but if you turn around on the buffet line, you'll probably see me. And you better believe we're going to be talking about punk music. And because this festival loves this podcast as much as this podcast loves this festival, Punk Rock Bowling is bringing you a series of special episodes. So each and every week, I will have an episode going up featuring someone that's playing this festival. And hot damn, are there some good ones coming. Head over to punkrockbowling.com and hopefully I see you in downtown Las Vegas, May 25th, 26th, and 27th.